Good afternoon. Though this is a virtual event with authors joining us from across Canada, Victoria Festival of Authors is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. We acknowledge the ancestors, hereditary leaders and matriarchs, as well as the creators from these lands, and give thanks for the privilege of living and working here. We are committed to serving as learners and listeners. I'm John Barton, the City of Victoria Poet Laureate. Welcome to Truth, Trauma, Beauty, Beast, featuring authors Amanda Leduc, Michael Pryor, and Jesse Thistle. Thank you to our sponsors, the BC Arts Council, Canada Council for the Arts, the City of Victoria, the Capital Regional District, the Government of British Columbia, the United Way of Greater Victoria, Monroe's Books, and the League of Canadian Poets. This event, as all VFA events, offers closed captioning. Please click the double C at the bottom of your screen to view captions. Please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen if you have questions for us or the authors during the event. The moderator will be able to get some of these questions near the end of the panel. This panel is moderated by Carla Funk. Carla served as Victoria's inaugural Poet Laureate and has published 5 books of poetry, the most recent of which is Gloryland from Turnstone Press. After 15 years of teaching in UVic's writing department, Carla now leads private writing classes and works as an editor. Every Little Scrap and Wonder, a memoir of her childhood in a small town full of logging trucks and God, was published by Greystone Books in late 2019. It is nominated for this year's Victoria Butler Prize. Her follow-up memoir is due out in fall 2021. Please welcome Carla Funk.
Thank you so much, John, for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for today's panel. The 3 authors in today's panel have written books that inhabit the realm of memoir in very different ways. That drawing from memories well and then pouring it out in imagery, music, narrative, complicated history, and with a ferocity for telling the truth. After reading Jesse Thistle's From the Ashes and Amanda Leduc's book Disfigured and Michael Pryor's collection of poems, Burning Province, after letting all that language and those stories simmer resonantly in my mind for a few weeks after reading, I couldn't stop thinking about how inherited narratives, inherited images, the stories that we are given, whether by gift or by trauma, how they become a transformative force when the writer takes hold of them and puts them into language. These authors, in very different and particular ways, pursue that truth through the fires of trauma, the reality of disability, the stronghold of archetypes, and they pursue it with a tenacity that is, I believe, redemptive. Whether they're writing about addiction, racism, physical disability, fairy tales, mental health, intergenerational trauma, or whether plumbing language itself to find new words for old patterns, these authors perform what I think is a beautiful resistance as they bring their own lives to the page. I'd like to welcome our first guest author and give a little introduction. Jesse Thistle is Métis Cree from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. He's an assistant professor in Métis Studies at York University in Toronto. He's a finalist for the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize and the Indigenous Voices Award. He has won a Governor General's Academic Medal and is a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Scholar and a Vanier Scholar. He lives in Hamilton, Ontario, like another of our authors on the panel. And many of you, I'm included in that, have probably heard a lot from Jesse and a lot about his book, on the recent Canada Reads competition. Please welcome, reading from his memoir, From the Ashes, our first panelist writer, Jesse Thistle. Welcome, Jesse.
Hi, thank you. And the piece that I'm going to read is called Dynamite. So buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy read. The wick on the stick of dynamite stuck out of my parka about 5 inches. I tucked it into my breast pocket as I headed towards the dope house. My crack dealer's name was Green, a gang member from Rexdale, Ontario, and his homies all had colors for names. I assume they got the idea from Reservoir Dogs. Green told his mates that I was dangerous and willing to do anything, and he was right. I had no fear of death after Samantha and I broke up and what happened with Flip and Audrey. Everyone was impressed that I'd robbed the convenience store and that I had eluded the cops with a cast on my leg. They started calling me Hot Boy after that. I hated the moniker, but it gave me a kind of respect, homeless or not. Piles of snow shimmered in the dusk as I hurried past the mechanic shop. The red stick felt heavy against my chest, like an iron bar. The Oxycontin I'd taken 3 hours earlier was wearing off. My foot was hurting like I'd been crucified with a 6-inch railway tie. The staph infection had come back. Cold crept into my ankle and seized the wires holding my foot together. I couldn't run or walk without the aid of pills, and pain could halt my mission. It doesn't matter, I resolved. I'm going to get a giant rock from those dealer scum, whether I'm high or not. My jaw muscles flexed and snapped the tooth I'd got fixed in jail. I spit the fragment onto the sidewalk, and it bounced off into the snowbank. A vision of Vancouver in the car came to me. I wanted revenge for the person that they turned me into. I whipped out my crack stem, loaded it with my last $20 of rock, and lit it. I needed that extra little push forward. Yellow flames licked the glass, and the rock melted, releasing a stream of thick smoke. It sizzled like Rice Krispies covered with milk. A gush of spit poured out of my mouth and thwacked onto the ice below. It froze into a beautiful spider web of crystals, making tiny squeaking noises as it formed. In an instant, my hearing had sharpened to superhuman levels. I spun around 360 degrees, scanning for the legion of hidden cops I knew tracked my every movement. I saw nothing but sensed they were close. Once I'd found a tracking device in my baseball cap, in the button on top. People told me it was just there to hold the hat together, but I didn't believe them. I ripped it off and chucked it in the Etobicoke River, hoping to evade capture. These tracking cops, I'd figured out, also sent coded messages to each other using car license plate numbers. 9 meant they were close, 2 or 5 meant they had a lock on my whereabouts and were moving in. I saw a car with a license plate and it had 2 and a 5, and it even slowed down as it passed by. I searched around for cover. I contemplated jumping into the bush, but decided against it. My ears were ringing from the intense crack high, and I almost slipped on the ice and dropped my payload of explosives. The blast of a rock also brought out those Ewok-looking shadow creatures that shot death rays at me with their galactic sorcery. Their chatter drove me nuts. They sounded exactly like they did in Star Wars. Me chippy chewa, ah, ah, ah. Fucking terrifying. They were stealthy little creatures melting in and out of the shadows. They reminded me of those demon shadows in Ghost that dragged that Puerto Rican Willie Lopez to hell for killing Patrick Swayze after he got hit by that car. I didn't want to end up like him. I lit my pipe again, hoping to rid myself of my paranoia, but an Ewok groaned from the darkness over near the curb. They're coming for me. I ran as fast as I could into the middle of the street where the light was strongest. My heart pounded until it hurt. I slapped my face to snap out of it. I slapped it again to remind myself that none of it was real. My arm knocked loose the dynamite and it tumbled down around my waist, inside my jacket. I placed it in my pocket and continued on. When I got to the dope house, one of Green's men was guarding the door. "Hot boy," he hollered as I approached. He held out his fist and I dapped it. He kept his eyes on my every move. The brown-black hilt of his Glock was exposed in his waistband, his shirt purposefully pulled up, warning people not to fuck around, and it didn't faze me. "Green around?" I smirked back, trying to play it cool. I felt a thunderbolt radiate up my leg. The oxy had worn off. Inside in the basement, he stood up and reached towards me. I jumped back. "What the fuck, guy?" I said, pushing his hands away from my torso. He was going to pat me down. "You know me, dog," I said. His face hardened, and he put his hand near his pistol. New policy. "What do you think? I got a stick of dynamite on me? Chill out." I laughed and nodded and nudged his shoulder. He laughed back. Wouldn't be surprised. He eyed me one more time and motioned with his head towards the door. "Go on in, and I'll leave the rest of the story there. I don't want to spoil it for future readers." Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Dynamite is the perfect title for that particular passage. Absolutely. Thank you. Our the next writer that I'd like to introduce from our panel is Amanda Leduc. Amanda Leduc's essays and stories have appeared in publications across Canada, the US, and the UK. She's the author of the novels The Miracles of Ordinary Men and the forthcoming, which I'm very excited about, The Centaur's Wife with Random House. It is by my reading and snooping around, a post-apocalyptic fairy tale of sorts. Amanda has cerebral palsy and she lives, like Jesse, in Hamilton, Ontario, where she works as the communications coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, FOLD, Canada's first festival for diverse authors and stories. She is the author of Disfigured, On Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. And this is the book she'll be reading from and discussing today on the panel. Please welcome Amanda Leduc.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I have to say too, just on a personal note, Carla was my poetry instructor not so many years ago at the University of Victoria, and it's just so lovely to share this space with you today. So I'm really, really excited for our conversation and to see what everybody brings to it. So Disfigured is about fairy tales and disability and the ways in which fairy tales, particularly Western fairy tales, have had a very specific narrative when it comes to disabled people and the disabled body. And it's a part memoir, part cultural criticism look at this sort of interweaving. So I'm going to read a little bit from the middle of the book that talks about the Little Mermaid, both the original version of the tale and the Disney version that most of us are probably a little more familiar with. Years after I first saw the Disney film, I read the Hans Christian Andersen version of The Little Mermaid. Now, all these years later, I find myself focused on this image, the mermaid, mute and heartbroken, arcing that one long dive into the sea. She has been mutilated in a number of ways, her tail and tongue taken from her, her ability to connect with others stolen from her as a result of the witch's machinations. She has no hope of convincing the prince in this story, bedazzled as he is by the beauty and charm of his new bride. She is made, by virtue of her disability, less than what he might desire. How should we take this in this world of modern day storytelling? Perhaps it's unrealistic to think that a different outcome could have visited this story, especially given the era of its provenance, since the rudimentary beginnings of European Sign Language were just entering infancy during Hans Christian Andersen's time. Still, if they didn't learn sign language, surely they could have communicated through gestures. Did no one in the palace think to teach the Little Mermaid how to read and write? In the Disney version of the film, Ariel physically signs a contract with Ursula the Sea Witch in order to give up her voice. Couldn't she have written Prince Eric a note? But fairy tales have historically been concerned with morals, and historically, morals have been concerned in a very particular way with the disabled. Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid is one of those people who might never reach the top of the social ladder, no matter how much they try. Disney's Ariel, by contrast, not only manages to regain her voice, her other disability, the immobility afforded by a mermaid's tail on land, is eradicated in her version's happy ending. At the end of the Disney movie, Ariel has her legs, her voice, and her prince. The original mermaid, by contrast, dies in the fairy tale with none of these things. So suddenly we have two versions of the story, one in which the disability is vanished and the abled body reigns supreme, and another in which the disability is permanent and leads to grief and suffering. Where is the space for disability as a simple fact of life in a scenario like this? If Ariel couldn't hope to get her prince when she didn't have legs and or a voice, what hope could a disabled girl like myself have for a life that was free of torment and bullying, unless she was also free of a limp and had all of her faculties intact? In a study conducted by the Feinberg School of Medicine at Chicago's Northwestern University, 44 children with cerebral palsy and 7 children with other motor disorders were interviewed about the bullying they experienced at school. 55% of the children reported some form of bullying about their appearance. Being left out of a group or being teased and called names were some of the highest reported forms of bullying, with 68% of the respondents noting that this teasing and name-calling dominated their time at school. The study authors' hypothesis at the outset of their research was that children with the most severe forms of physical disability were the most likely to be targeted for bullying. Instead, as they noted at the study's conclusion, we found that children with mild to moderate gross impairment seemed to be at greater risk for peer and bully victimization than more severely impaired children. They're bullies because they don't understand, my parents would say to me over and over. One night, my father hugged me as I stood at the end of the driveway, sobbing after I got home off the bus. The best thing you can do, Amanda, is ignore them. They aren't important. One day, nothing that they say or do to you will matter. I don't want to be like this, I remember thinking, all through my long, horrid time in elementary school. Why do I have to be like this? Why can't I be normal? Why can't I walk like everyone else? Why is everyone so mean? Looking back on this now, from almost 30 years in the future, I can see multiple things at once on behalf of that little girl who dreaded getting on the bus every morning. The children I went to school with were not evil, not even my nemesis, persistent antagonist in my life though she was. They were children, responding to a world that had already told them so much about what it meant to move through the world in a way that was different. Like the stratified society of Andersen's Copenhagen, their beliefs about what it meant to be different had everything to do with social expectation and success. The schoolyard is a cruel place in the same way that the world is a cruel place, not because of individuals, although that is also sometimes true, but because collectively we seek to belong, to blend in, to be accepted, and it is easier to shun those who do not fit in rather than to risk one's own spot in the system. Why can't I be like everyone else, says the woodcutter who longs for a child. Why can't I be like everyone else, says the lonely queen who wishes for the same thing. Why can't I be like everyone else, says the Little Mermaid. No one is asking the right question. We know that in fairy tales no one has to, because salvation and happiness, even happiness of a kind, comes to most of these individuals anyway. Society is not changed, but somehow our heroes come out on top. Eventually, everyone in a fairy tale meets one of two fates. They get what they want, which is to be just like everyone else, or they do not get what they want, and they die destitute and alone, a cautionary tale for others who might likewise wish for unattainable things. But what happens when we ask a different question? What happens when the princess or the childless parent or the half-human child says instead, Why should I be like everyone else? What kinds of stories might we get to tell then? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to come back to some of what you were reading about, this idea of asking different questions, and we'll grab that as a point of discussion later. Thank you so much. Our third and final reader today, and maybe this betrays a little bit of my allegiance to the genre that I left. I saved the poetry for last, but I'd like to introduce Michael Pryor. Michael is a writer and a teacher. His poems have appeared in such prestigious places as Poetry, The New Republic, Narrative, Poetry Northwest, and the Academy of American Poets Poem-a-Day series, Resisting Canada and The Next Wave. He is a past winner of the Magma Poetry's Editors Prize, the Walrus's Poetry Prize, and Matrix Magazine's Lit Pop Award for Poetry. His first collection, Model Disciple, which came out in 2016 with Vehicle Press, was named one of the best books of the year by the CBC. His second collection, Burning Province, which was published this past spring, spring 2020, by McClelland and Stewart, is the book he'll be reading from today. And Michael is joining us all the way from the Twin Cities. And so we'd like to make a special welcome to Michael, traveling all this way to us. And Michael, welcome. And I'm so looking forward to your poems.
Thank you so much, Carla. And thank you to the Victoria Festival of Authors for hosting this event. And thank you, Amanda and Jesse, for your powerful work and your brilliant presences. And thank you, everyone, for being here in the audience. Where I'm reading from in Minnesota is on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people, who are forcibly exiled from the land because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism. I wanted to acknowledge that before I started the reading. So I'm going to be reading two poems today from the new book, and I wanted to provide a little context for them. I'm a Yonsei, a fourth generation Japanese Canadian, and so not long after Pearl Harbor, my maternal grandparents and their families, like 20,000 other Japanese Canadians, were forcibly incarcerated in internment camps in British Columbia. So the book is an attempt to think through kind of the intergenerational echoes of this trauma, of this event. And it's focused a lot on memory and family, as well as my own mixed race experience. Like the majority of Japanese Canadians of my generation, I'm mixed race. So the first poem I want to read responds to a multimedia sequence by a Japanese Canadian artist, Kayla Isumura, called The Suitcase Project. And what Isumura did is she traveled up and down the west coast of Canada and America, and she presented fourth and fifth generation Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans with their original internment orders. You have 24 or 48 hours. Adults are allowed to bring 150 pounds of luggage, children 75 pounds of luggage. And she then asked them to pack as if they were going to a camp. And she came back and photographed what they packed. So I was really struck by this sequence when I first encountered it. It made me think of Derek Walcott has a quote about a poetics that conjugates the past and present tense simultaneously, which is something I'm very interested in my work. So this poem kind of responds to some of the images from Isumura's work. It's called 150 Pounds. And it begins with an epigraph from the BC Security Commission, who organized the internment. Each adult will be allowed 150 pounds, and each child will be allowed 75 pounds of baggage. In some, the luggage lies open like a mouth mid-sentence. In others, closed zippers grimace. What would you have brought? Slippers, a stuffed platypus, a gold watch on a chain, copper pots swaddled in bedding. The hypotheses that thinking can be things, that each decision shrinks a pained mind to the space inside a suitcase, include lacquered chopsticks, silver forks, a hammer scarred by rust, the orders nailed to telephone poles and doors. Omit what you whispered then, most of what you've seen. I was given 48 hours notice. 24, I passed ice and pines and plains. I rode an iron serpent into the interior beside 400 others. It was humid. It was cold. If pain is remembered to be dismissed, if fear still seeds its rotting forest, this is a gardener's trowel, a blue skein of yarn, a violin, a ukulele, a ukulele, a ukulele. This is a porch light flicked on and off an abscessed night. These are pear blossoms falling on the driveway like footprints in black ice. Memories, river stones metamorphic and worn. How many might an able-bodied individual carry through livestock stalls and mud, onto a bus, a train, into a tiny, uninsulated shack? Most say the same. It could happen again. It is happening now. I couldn't make room for a dogless collar, a houndstooth scarf, a steel urn packed in styrofoam, a letter recording blood's divisive fractions. My father would not have come. My mother, my stepsister, my brother. What matters is not what you bring, but what you keep. She was there. He was too. So I'm just going to read one more poem. It's the last poem in the book, and it's another poem that thinks about family and memory. It's also kind of a love poem. And it begins with an epigraph from the medieval Japanese monk Kenko. You should never put the new antlers of a deer to your nose and smell them. They have little insects that crawl into the nose and devour the brain. Wakeful things. Consider that the insects might be metaphor, that the antler's wet velvet scent might be Proust's Madeleine, dipped into a cup of tea, adorned with centrifugal patterns of azalea and willow. Those flushing the hill behind this room, walls wreathed in smoke and iron, musk of the deer head above the mantel. He was nailed in place before I was me. Through the floorboards, a caterpillar, stripped from its chrysalis by red ants, wakes as if to a house of flame. Silk frays like silver horns, like thoughts branching from a brain. After the MRI, my father's chosen father squinted at the wormholes raveling the screen and said, "Be good to one another. Love, how inelegantly we leave, how insistent we are to return in one form or another. I wish all of this and none of it for us. More sun, more tempest, more fear and fearlessness, more of that which is tempered, carved, and worn, creased into overlapping planes. The way I feel the world's aperture enlarge in each morning's patchwork blur of light and color while I fumble for my glasses beside the bed, lenses smudged by both our hands. When they were alive, those antlers held up the sky. Now, what do they hold?" Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Amanda, for reading. I just love listening to people's imaginations and memories make their way into language, and then the authors themselves reading the words. It's just striking me as I'm listening to all three of you that it's a bit miraculous that we're all here at this point in history listening to these words. And if anyone would have said when you, Amanda, were a child, or Jesse, you were a child, and Michael, you were a child, that one day you'd be sitting in the company of these writers, these people, and these words, we might not have believed it. So thank you for being here miraculously. I want to open our conversation with a question for all of you about the origin stories of the books that you're reading from today. They're all inhabiting memoir in different ways, or at least the work of memory. And I always think of memory having the remembering part, putting back together pieces. And all of the work that you are reading from today have that quality, that they are remembering and they are working and wrestling with memory. But every work of literature has its own origin story. So I wonder if you might just take us into the starting inklings of these books that, you know, started in language or started in thought, I suppose, and then made their way. So Amanda, why don't you start and just say a little bit about the origin story of Disfigured?
Sure. So Disfigured started out of an idea that kind of came to me about, well, I guess 2.5 years ago now, almost 2.5 years ago. I detail this a little bit in the beginning of the book. I was at a writing retreat on the West Coast, off the coast of Seattle, and I was working on a novel, which, as it happened, turned out to be The Centaur's Wife. And I was having a really tough day with it, and I went for a walk in the woods to kind of get my mind in order. And as I was walking, I was using a walking stick. And so I have cerebral palsy, and I have a limp in my day-to-day, and sometimes it's more pronounced than others. And I often notice it when I'm walking through the forest because the ground is very uneven. So I always have to be really careful about where I go, because I could trip and then throw my back out or like twist my ankle very, very easily. And I was noticing as I walked that my walking stick was really helping with that. And I thought, you know, maybe I should wear or use rather a cane in my day-to-day. And I was thinking about forests and how forests are sort of inaccessible to the disabled body, but forests are also something that we very quickly associate with magic and fairy tales and that sort of thing. And I was sort of just kind of thinking about this idea of forests as being inaccessible, but also forests as being this very sort of fairy tale setting. And then I was like, well, you know, but disabled people aren't in fairy tales. And I was like, wait a minute, no, of course, disabled people are in all fairy tales. Almost all of the regular fairy tales that we tell have people in them who are disabled in some way, shape, or form, but we haven't traditionally conceptualized of them as disabled people because we see them as villains or we see them as symbols of something else. So the disability in fairy tales isn't talked about. And this sort of hit me all of a sudden. And it seemed so obvious that I was like, well, I really would like to write an essay about this, but obviously it must have been written about tons of times before. People who are much smarter than me have probably talked about it a lot. So I ended up going back to my little cottage and going back to working on the novel. But then when I left the retreat, I was still thinking about that, and I did some research and found that there wasn't actually a lot about that connection, or at least not as much as I had thought about initially. So the essay in my mind started getting bigger and growing and you know, sprouting more chapters, and then all of a sudden it was a book. And it just, you know, it worked out that Coach House was very, very excited about the idea and came on board, and sort of now here we are. So it did have a very fairy tale beginning, I guess you could say, at the end of things.
I love that you were walking in a forest, and I love that. And you're right, that the forest is this enchantment place, the site of enchantment in so many fairy tales, and that place where some sort of revelation or illumination comes. And I love that you were embodying the fairy tale sort of narrative, but also wrenching it out of its archetypal stronghold and already arresting it, bringing it into something new. Thank you, Amanda. Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about where the seeds for the collection began with Burning Province?
I mean, yeah, sure. Thank you. It's the stories about the internment and like this event kind of was always on the peripheries of my life growing up. My grandparents were very reticent to talk about it, like many people of their generation. I think a common kind of refrain is shikaraganai, which means it can't be helped. You know, the past is in the past. Of course, the past is never in the past. And so it was something that I always felt intruding upon my experience. And as I got older, I asked them more about it and they opened up more. And it became this thing that I was very interested in, kind of tracing the ramifications, the echoes of this event, and how it shaped, you know, who my mother is, who I am, certainly shaped my grandparents. But the thing I think that catalyzed the collection was in 2015, my grandmother, who had raised me when I was young, passed away. And it was the same time there were all these forest fires in British Columbia. And I remember being in the palliative care ward of VGH, the 16th floor, and the sky was orange, and there were these clouds of smoke rolling through the city out into the bay. And my grandmother was, a day or two away from passing. And that whole particular sensory palette became the kind of grammar for the collection. And it started from there. It felt like the world was mourning for her, which of course, we're taught is a pathetic fallacy, but experientially, it's often not a fallacy.
Thank you, Michael. Even this, just in the last few weeks on the West Coast in Victoria, where I live, there was smoke rolling in from the fires from Washington and California. And I, of course, having been sitting in your poems and reading your poems, I kept thinking about that, the fallacy of pathetic fallacy, that it's often so true that the natural world is talking to us about the emotional or psychological or spiritual landscape of what's going on around us. And I kept thinking about your poems. Thank you. And Jesse, do you want to talk a little bit about the origin of From the Ashes, just how the life, the life that you write about and these memories, this memoir, how it started to take shape in book form?
Well, it started to take shape in rehab. It's actually just my AA steps that I was writing, that I had been writing while I was in university. And so that's basically what the book is. It's just me working through my amendment steps. So trying to make sense of my addiction and what had happened to my family as Métis Cree people on the plains, what happened to our land. And so I had to write all these things out to get better. And so I was asked by Simon & Schuster to write a book after a story about me appeared in the newspaper about my academic successes.
Mm-hmm.
So I see myself primarily as an academic and not an author, which is kind of strange. They called me into their office at Simon & Schuster, and I didn't know what Simon & Schuster was at the time because I read like University of Manitoba type of stuff. And so when I went in, they asked me if I had anything written about my life. And I said, well, I do have my Alcoholics Anonymous steps that I've been doing for the past 6 years. And I sent them to them, and they offered me a major book contract. So that's how the book came to be and what it actually is and why it's structured the way it is too.
There's, I'll weave in a question that was put forth by one of our audience members, and the question had to do, and I'll just pick up on what you were talking about, Jesse, about this memoir arriving out of your amendment steps from AA. The question had to do with why do you think, it was specifically addressed to you, why do you think that some people who struggle with addiction are able to break free and some are not? And I mean, that's such a huge question. And have you seen anything from your own experience that was that gave a suggestion of an answer as to why you were able to move out of it, and why what might have held you back from recovery?
Sure. Yeah, I think I really strongly believe in the work of way smarter people than I am, like Gabor Mate, who studies trauma and addiction. And so people that in this realm of like addiction understandings believe that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. It's human connection. That's human connection and relationships. Healthy relationships are what pulls a person out of addiction. And so with me, I met the girl of my dreams. I liked her since I was like 10 years old, right? And so she came back into my life while I was in rehab, and she created, like, they would call it peer mentorship. She let me live with her, and she kind of navigated me through all of life's ups and downs. You know, she taught me how to like drive again. She taught me how to like access OSAP. She was just and now she's my wife. I scooped her up. So that's what was the difference, is that I had a healthy relationship and people that loved me back into the circle, where some people don't have that, right? They don't forge those healthy relationships, and then they fall back into addiction. So
thank you for sharing that and answering that question from an audience member. I wanted to talk or hear your thoughts, all of you, on what happens to the writer, the human, who takes hold of the inherited narratives that we're all given them, whether or not we are turning to writing to bring them into language. We're all given inherited narratives. And it strikes me that they can be a gift if we take hold of them in a way that is open to transformation, I suppose, or open to hearing the truth. But I would be curious to know from you, what happened in the process of writing that was new for you, surprising for you, transformative even, by doing the work of memory? Jesse, now you've answered that a little bit already by talking about the memoir beginning as amendment steps, but feel free to add, or Amanda, Michael, jump in and talk a little bit about that.
Michael, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Amanda. There's a part of Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress that I really love, and she's paraphrasing Thomas Merton, I think, and she talks about how the purpose of an education is to provide one with the means to spontaneously and authentically define oneself in relation to the world. And that, for me, is also a very good definition of what an honest poem does. And so that's, that was the process of the book. It was kind of an act of discovery. And so I don't know if there's like a specific one kind of transformative or revelatory experience, but there were many small ones in the process of writing the book. It certainly made me reassess my relationship with my grandparents and my mother. I learned a lot about the history that I hadn't, known before. And it certainly let me kind of think about the forces that have shaped who I am in a new way, and how, they might have been much more insidious and intricate than I had perhaps previously thought. I'm very interested in how, or in which, who gets to decide the kind of what defines authenticity in a particular diasporic culture, especially in a culture like Japanese Canadian culture, where most people are mixed race and not everyone speaks the language anymore. And so the book was also kind of an exploration of that, and what family traditions and what family memories make up the culture, bind us to the people we love. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Amanda.
I think for me, one of the really surprising things about writing Disfigured was that I had sort of, I think we can all attest to this as writers. You kind of go into something with an idea, at least, of what you want it to be, and then usually the actual finished product ends up being quite different. And I had sort of thought that I wanted the book to be a little more on the side of cultural criticism and maybe not so much memoir. But almost right from the beginning, the memoir side of it really started to come out, and it felt very natural to write it that way. So I just sort of went with it. And what was really interesting to me was that the cycle of writing the book was actually not the end, because this is never a journey that ends, but there was something about it that was very cumulative for me in terms of my own journey as a disabled person. I needed to go back to the stories of who I was and the inherited narratives that I sort of both inherited and then sort of carried with me as a young disabled child. And these were narratives that I had really turned away from for a really long time. I am disabled, but it's a slight mild disability. So, I can pass as able-bodied, and I tried to pass as able-bodied for a really long time, because that was how you survived. That's how you fit into society. And in writing the book, I recognized that I actually needed to go back to that little child who I had turned away from, and really kind of come full circle, which, I guess it feels a little bit cliche, but it's true. I think, when you do, as you say, Carla, you have these inherited narratives that you carry with you. You do have to reckon with them in some way, shape, or form. Eventually, you can't run away from them forever. So that was surprising. And I think what was also surprising about that was that it wasn't really as painful as I thought. Maybe going back to some of those memories and that small child would be. It was actually really liberating. which, you know, is an experience that I wish for all writers. I wish it could be as wonderful for all of us. Having said that, I also know that it's not the case, right? And the next book that you write may be entirely different in terms of the writing of it and the process of pulling all of these things outside of yourself. But yeah, we'll see. Either way, there will always be surprises, and I think we just have to welcome them into the process.
I love that. Jesse, what surprised you in the writing?
Surprised me? I would say how difficult some things that I thought were mundane, like that. Like there was an instance where I broke a girl's heart when I was a young man that was something that I ran away from, that I was shameful of, that I was a coward because I didn't know love. And when I first got it, I sabotaged it like a lot of young men do. And I ran away and I broke her heart. And like, I noticed that throughout my writing of my book, some of those amendments didn't get to that level. And so I broke my grandparents' heart too, in using drugs the way I did. And so, yeah, that was really surprising to me, to see the kind of like wreckage that I left behind in my addiction that all addicts do, you know, and then trying to come to terms with what actually happened. So, yeah.
I'm fascinated by narrative therapy. It's just a particular area of therapy that just fascinates me because of its use of story, and everything that I've read about narrative therapy and heard people talk about when they have gone through narrative therapy, it speaks of the importance of, like you said, Jesse, some of the mundane that you thought were mundane details turned out to not be mundane details. And narrative therapy holds to this idea that we have to go back into the stories in order to find healing, in order to go for the transformation. And in fact, it doesn't have to be anything spectacular in our memories. It can be those moments that seem common and small, but they've stayed with us for some strange reason. They've lurked in the background and we can't let go of them. And so narrative therapy would say, you go in there, you write them out and you speak that story, and there's something to be walked through. And I'm struck in all of your work that these small shimmering details often hold such resonant power because they will trigger in the reader some memory of some, you know, seemingly equally mundane, but that it holds power. So thank you for being willing to go back into the details and be surprised by your own stories. I want to turn a little bit and maybe go back to your own upbringings with and your relationship to story. Do you remember being read to when you were younger? And if so, or told stories, what stories from your own childhoods stayed with you? You know, those stories you're told or read and they sort of haunt you, not necessarily they might be in a bad way, it might be in a good way, but the ones that settled in you and stuck with you. Whether read, whether they were books or whether they were stories told, what remains, what stayed with you from childhood? Jesse?
Oh yeah, I got a great one. My grandfather, Searle, was Cape Bretoner, and we used to go to the Cape Breton Highlands every year. And there's like this overpass, and then it goes down into a valley, and then you can see the majestic mountains on the one side, as you go to where he's from. And so every year around this turn, he would look up and there was 3 mountains there, and one in the middle had no trees on it. It was like full of rocks. And he's like, Jesse, when I was a young boy, I was at the bottom of that hill, and we used to live at the top, and my mother called me up for supper, and I ran so fast up that hill that I ran right out of my shoes and I tore out all the trees with my toes. And I believed it, right? I believed that story, and I went around and told everybody on my block that my grandfather balded a whole mountain with his bare feet to get to dinner with his mom. And he was, I think, the first great lesson in story that I had, because he was just doing that everywhere. He told people that he coached the Leafs, the Maple Leafs, and I believed him, and I went around and told all my friends. I got beat up for that a lot from my friends because they didn't believe me. But that's the way he was with storying. It was the more fantastic, the better, and there was always some sort of lesson in those stories too. So it was beautiful.
That's the other question I was going to ask, Jesse, is was there some sort of, was the story a vehicle for delivering some sort of lesson, moral, or truth? Was that often at the sort of center of the story, or was it entertainment?
Well, it could have been entertainment. I don't know what the moral of the story is, running up that mountain with bare feet, but I still remember it. Maybe that's the lesson, though, is that story has the power to make us believe, and that's the lesson in it. So
That I love that. And I'm going to be remembering. I think all of us are going to be remembering that image. And you're right. Therein lies the power of story, a story well told. Michael, what about you?
I think, I don't know if this is a story per se, but it's a very strong memory, I guess. It's their story. My grandparents, when I was little, told me about in the camps how when people passed away, they would burn the body on a funeral pyre, because of the traditional kind of Japanese cremation method. And so I remember around the same time they told this story, I was obsessed with Star Wars, the last film in the original trilogy. And I used to make them watch it with me all the time because they had it on VHS at their house. And of course, at the end of that film, Darth Vader's body is burned on a pyre. And it wasn't until years later I learned that George Lucas was drawing on Japanese culture, Japanese films like Kurosawa and stuff, to create the kind of aesthetic of the original Star Wars movies. And so I always wondered what they thought about that, because I made them watch it dozens and dozens of times with me. And looking back, it's this very strange like convergence of like art and life and memory. I don't know if there's a moral there, but it certainly became something I was interested in, the ways in which like a family's memories can kind of like be refracted in a greater culture.
It's a very vivid image. And it makes me think of a sort of aesthetic that runs through your poetry, which is the tethering of these two worlds, like you say, history with the contemporary moment and how those two weave together. Also, I love that you've referenced Star Wars after Jesse read a passage with Ewoks in a paranoid state. That's great. Also, Jesse, I wanted to commend you on your Ewok talk. That was fantastic. Amanda, for you, it sounds like obviously fairy tales played very strongly in the narrative soundtrack of your childhood, but do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, fairy tales, I think I should, fairy tales, the Disney versions of fairy tales. I didn't really read the more grown-up versions until I was, a grown-up. But I think what actually had even more of a pull were science fiction and fantasy stories. And I didn't really think about why. I just, liked to escape into worlds that were entirely different and magical and the things that were possible with the imagination. And then as I got older and started doing more writing of my own, sort of consistently found myself, pulled towards those kind of fabulous elements in fiction. And then when I started writing about disability, a couple of years ago, a friend said, "Oh, you can see in your writing from before, it's always been really interested in the body." And I was like, "Oh, that's right." Even when I was writing, stories maybe about a man who's growing wings or things like that, there's something about the body and the different body that I've always really found quite fascinating. And within that, the idea of transformation, right? And I think as a child, there was part of me that was drawn toward these stories because I saw transformation as a kind of the magic that could happen to put you back to where you would fit into the world. There's an American writer by the name of Ross Showalter. He's a deaf writer, and he wrote and published an essay that was actually just published online a couple days ago. And it's really, really beautiful about his own experience of being deaf and being a deaf writer and feeling like, he was growing up without a community, but being drawn to narratives of science fiction and fantasy for that exact reason, because they're narratives that have always encapsulated difference in some way, and they've done it in a way that the sort of mainstream world has been willing to accept in ways that the mainstream world hasn't necessarily been as open with, sort of real life stories of disability. And I find that very interesting, going back to what Michael was talking about, where, your sort of art and life and your memories all kind of converge into this one space. That's really kind of been interesting to look back on my own life and the stories that I've been drawn to and see those same themes kind of coming out again and again and again.
Thank you for that. There was something that you raised in the passage you read, Amanda, about we need to ask different questions. Mm-hmm. And I believe there's another line that you have in your book where it talks about we need to tell different stories. And I don't even want to say the phrase, I'm not going to say it, but I'll just reference that somebody was recently, I heard somebody refer to a meme that was going around that said, I miss precedented times. And I thought, oh, I like that. But in this current season that we're in the world, what stories do we need? What questions are we needing to ask as humans and as writers who bear a kind of responsibility, even though, Jesse, you say you don't consider yourself a writer, you consider yourself an academic. They're still, obviously, we're all interested in the kinds of stories, narratives, the kind of language and the kind of questions that are being brought into the shared space of our world. I'd love to know what kind of stories and what kind of poems, what kind of images and what kind of questions you have a passion to see increase in our shared space of the world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on a personal level, I think we need to see more stories by disabled writers, both stories that center disability and then also stories by disabled writers that maybe don't necessarily have to do with disability all that much, but are just disabled writers putting themselves out into the world. One of the things that I've been finding really interesting over these last couple of months as we sort of, have made our way through the pandemic wasteland, is how it's really illuminated that there are communities that have existed on the margins of society for a very long time who have very particular insight into the way that the world has collapsed and very particular ways of helping people, because this is the kind of world upheaval that they've been very used to for a long time. I mean, you look at things like when the pandemic first sort of took hold, I would scroll through Twitter and see a lot of disability advocates and contacts of mine talking about things like, oh, if you're experiencing skin hunger because you're not able to touch anybody, here, use a weighted blanket. These are really, really helpful. If you're worried about going out to get groceries, here are some meal services that you can use that we as disabled people who haven't been able to leave our houses for a long time have also been able to use. So I think, there's a real power in recognizing that the world has broken in many ways because it has been operating under a one-size-fits-all model that has left a lot of people out, and that has proven itself to be unsustainable. And now that the world is broken, the people who have had to make do on the fringes are able to say, look, this is some insight that I have that is very valuable to the way that the world is now. You should be listening to me and my insight and my stories. And I think people who, maybe who haven't been on the margins as much really need to stop and listen to these stories, right? And we really need to recognize the importance of reading and taking in stories from viewpoints and experiences that aren't our own. I guess, yeah, I'll stop there because I'm sure we can build on that. But Michael, you've been nodding a lot. Do you have things to add?
So I completely agree with everything you're saying, Amanda. And that last point about, perspectives, viewpoints that are not our own. When I teach, I always tell my students, F relatability. I'm not interested in that as a metric for art, right? Or for engaging with things, right? I mean, it can be an important thing, recognition, but I'm interested in art that can articulate certain complex questions. I mean, that's what I think poetry does, right? It's about attention and it's about questions. And I'm interested in any art that is, providing the sort of attention or articulating the questions that are going to help us imagine a better future.
Jesse, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with we have to hear stories from other points of view. Like, we're in an era where people are more and more stuck in their own echo chamber, their own ecosystem. Social media does that. Whatever you follow, you usually follow people that are in the same family of thinking that you are, right? And then there's the opposite partisan perspective, and then there's this perspective and that. So we're kind of locked in our little worlds, right? And we're not really seeing the diversity of different stories that are out there, ones that challenge what we think, one that will unseat, because what's happening, we're in an era where nobody's talking to each other and we're all just reaffirming what we believe, and that's very dangerous, right? And so we're seeing a lot of that in the political climate. And so I agree with Amanda. I think we need to shift the center of where these stories are coming from and focus on people that haven't been highlighted in the past. And I think that will change our perspective of what story is, or privileging different voices. We're in an era that we need to start doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I love how you described, Amanda, the sense of our world being broken and how there's wisdom available. And I tend to believe that wisdom is only given entrance and asked to come in when there is a state of brokenness. Often it takes the brokenness to open whatever that structure that's been so tightly bound to be humbled enough to say, okay, wisdom, come in here. And it does feel, and maybe this is my gravitation toward optimism and hope, but it does feel like we are in an opportunity as a global force or culture to be postured, to be postured in an attitude of humility where we can actually learn. I guess there's a teachable moment globally happening. And are you hopeful for what comes next? Are you hopeful? Do you find yourself hopeful? And if so, what are you hoping for? What's giving you hope, I guess?
I think I am. I think I'm generally a hopeful person. I will say, though, that it has been particularly hard this year. It's been a disheartening year in many ways. But I think, Carla, you mentioned humility, and I think that's at the center of everything. People get angry online, especially now. The internet is basically a rage machine. People get angry, I think, because they're afraid of things that they don't understand, and afraid of being told that they're wrong, because we've forgotten what it means, or we just don't pay attention to what it means to start from those humble roots, right? And to understand that everybody is on a journey and everybody learns and grows. And for me, that humility and hope go hand in hand. So on the days when I'm feeling particularly drastic about the state of the world, I really try and remember that and think about, like, okay, what are ways that I can put myself low to the ground in a good way? Like, how can I reconnect, right? There's that whole thing about being humble, the roots of the word, I forget exactly what they are, but something about it meaning essentially low to the ground, like putting oneself down in such a way that you can be in a space to pay attention to other things than yourself. I think it's a really important thing for me. It's a really important practice for me going forward to kind of keep myself grounded. And I hope, that it's something that we can share as writers and as readers, and really kind of looking at things, and you would know this, Carla, from your own work, right? Looking at things through that veil of wonder, and how that really puts us in place in a good way.
I think, Jesse, you were referring to just the sort of loud noise of the world online. And I think sometimes humility is silence, and it's letting those other narratives, those other narrators, those other storytellers, those other humans speak, who have been forced into a state of being humbled. That's oppression. So I love the idea. I think it was the philosopher Blaise Pascal who said that so much of the world's chaos and woe would be solved if every human would sit in silence for 10 minutes. And I love that notion. Michael or Jesse, what's giving you hope, or what might tip you toward hope when you look at the stories that might rise up in the world? And yeah.
Can I go first, Michael?
Sure.
I was very hopeful when I learned that President Trump caught COVID. I'm not going to lie, as most people were, because like we're in a dumpster fire because of like what's going on. So, but then I got humbled, like during Canada Reads, my community. I have a big ego, and I got humbled online. And so you're right. Sometimes being quiet is good for the soul. It actually was the best thing that ever happened to me, to leave social media and focus on family and be humble, because there's other storytellers that need the space to share. And that's hopeful, because I learned a lesson, and I think that's what we're on, learning journeys together. So.
See, that gives me hope, that just what you're saying, Jesse, about it really does come down to the individual human being humbled, right? Like those moments where we accept, I'm humbled. Like if that can happen to all of us, then I'm hopeful.
well, it was the community aunties that humbled me. So like I have to give credit where credit's due, right?
So we all need our community aunties to
yes.
talk while we sit silent. Michael, what about you?
I mean, I live in the Twin Cities, and it's been a very humbling, heartbreaking summer. But it's also been like a source of inspiration and hope too, the way to see different communities come together and support each other and resist certain things in this time. I mean, I have to hope. I'm a teacher. And, you have to have hope, I think, to teach in some ways. And my students are constantly humbling me and showing me like what the future might look like through their kind of ambition and their goals and the generosity of their outlook in the world. So.
There is nothing like being a teacher, to both just standing in front of a group of people to both remind you that you are nothing but. I think there's a rabbi's saying where we need to remember, we need to hold in each hand a stone, and in one hand the stone reminds us that there's no one in the world like us. The stone is singular, unique, and then in the other hand the stone reminds us that we're just dust. And I love the idea of carrying that in us as we move in the world. I have a few questions that we'll move toward more explicit questions. Not explicit, that sounds bad. We'll move toward questions more explicitly. That I just maybe the word explicit. I'm going to weave in a question right now that a viewer has asked. What's been the effect on your life by writing this book? Jesse, you referenced Canada Reads, so there's an effect.
Yeah, Canada Reads. I left social media to like focus on family, and I've taken the winning from some of the awards, and me and my wife are doing IVF with the money. So we're creating life from the actual the proceeds of what we did with the book. We're a little late to the party. I'm in my 40s, and so is my wife. So to us, it's like it gave us the ability to do something that we would never have been able to do, and that's to me, the book is a success just for that one thing. So that's how it changed my life.
I love that. I'm hopeful for that too.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's, and I mean, you can't kind of be more poetic than writing a book called From the Ashes. And then, like you said, from that, you're working toward creating life. That's beautiful. I love that. Michael, what about you? How has writing this book changed your life?
I don't know if it has really. I mean, it's certainly, you have to write the thing you're writing to get on to the next thing. And I've already started a new manuscript, so that has been something that's come of it. I mean, I think it's certainly, I've lived away from Canada for over half a decade now. And I miss it a lot. And it's certainly and I miss my family this time. And it's certainly, the process of putting together the book made me feel much closer to them.
What's it like to launch a book of poems during a pandemic?
I mean, launching a book of poems, as you know, Carla, is a difficult enterprise in a culture that kind of marginalizes poetry already. In a pandemic, it's been super difficult, but it makes it also in a way all the more kind of wonderful when you do hear from someone who's read it and it's meant something to them. Yeah, it's been a strange thing. Poetry moves a lot slower in the world, I think, than prose often, and so the response takes a little longer. But yeah.
Has there been, have you done poetry readings appearing in a sort of virtual salon in people's living rooms, reading poems? Are you available for hire in terms of readings? And I mean, we could start a whole thing here of poets appearing in living rooms. Just subscribe to Michael's Zoom account.
That would be lovely. And I'm sure like Jesse and Amanda are open to give readings too. Yeah, I mean, I gave a very big reading. I was one of the keynote speakers at Cornell University from this department this year. And that was like a wonderful experience because a lot of my former students were there. So that was nice. But
yeah. I'm hooked on this idea where, you know, screw Netflix, like let's get live authors reading in your living room to you individually for a very high price.
In cars getting coffee, except the poetry version. Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Yeah, Carla, do it.
Yeah.
Do it.
So if there's someone out there who has a lot of money to give away to writers appearing in Zoom windows, drinking red wine, I don't know, tea, herbal tea at night. Amanda, how has writing Disfigured shifted? I mean, when I say changed your life, like obviously, you know, it might not be this huge something, you know, confetti fell from the sky, but how, yeah, how has it changed you?
So I was going for a walk in Hamilton maybe a couple of months ago with a friend, and she was talking about seeing Disfigured out in the world, and she said it feels like you have put a flagpole down into the ground and said, this is my land, this is where I am. And it was a really lovely image for me, because then she also said it's a flagpole and a tent pole at the same time. It's like something that's holding up all of these other worlds that you're creating and things that you're hoping to do in your work. And it really does feel that way for me. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that my novel that's coming out in February, The Centaur's Wife, took 5 years to write, which feels like a long time to me. And I really struggled with it for a long time. And Disfigured, from like getting the idea in my head to the book actually being, you know, ready for publication, took about, I want to say like 10 months. It came really, really quickly, and it came so naturally that looking back now, it just seems inevitable that book was supposed to come first. And the writer, Sheila Hady, often talks about understanding that when she's in the act of writing something, she's also in the act of becoming the person she needs to be in order to finish the book. And I needed to become a person who was comfortable with my disability and speaking about it in the world in order to finish this book, and then in order to finish other books as well. So that, you know, is maybe not an external change in my life, but like it's been an earthquake of change on the inside, I think. And it's been really, really lovely. Like it's wonderful to get to a point where you recognize that you're really, really comfortable with who you are as a human being. And I'm so grateful to the book for that, because I don't think I would have recognized that without it.
It's beautiful. I love the idea of a particular season of working on a book or collection of poems, how that it does set a flagpole of some sort. It sort of, it marks I think it was Heidegger talked about that we work from a site and we pull everything that's there to pull, and then we pick up and we move, and we're always connected to that site, but it moves us to the next thing. Here's a question that has come from one of our audience, our viewers, and it's to do with working from personal story, family narrative, those inherited narratives. And when you're working in a form that, whether it's a poem, and poems, you know, they have this beautiful liberty where you can say it's the truth, but it's, you know, you've changed some facts. But when you're working in memoir and in essay form, you're binding yourself to being credible to the facts, sticking with them, trying to be as truthful as possible. How did you find the process of bringing in family stories and details that involved other people? And the question has to do with, was there content that was sensitive or that you needed to negotiate carefully? And if so, how, when it came to dealing with content that affected other people? So whether, Amanda, it's you, family, Jesse, family, well, all of you dealing with family. Were there challenges that you faced? And if so, what were they with dealing with family history?
I think with this particular memoir project, I got really lucky. I think so much of Disfigured is specifically about me and my experience, that I wasn't, because when a lot of my surgeries that the book focuses around happened when I was quite young. So I do pull my parents in, but they're sort of pulled in via doctor's notes and, you know, conversations that I had with them. And then the latter part of the book is about me as an adult and sort of making my way through that space of coming into disability. And I think I will have, I mean, I have had in the past quite different experiences when I'm trying to write about people in my life, because there's always the sense that, you know, I'm telling a story, and in my experience, it might be a true story, but there's always that, you know, magical thing that happens when you involve somebody else and they don't remember it the way that you do. So I guess that's my answer for this particular book. Ask me the question again, maybe in 10 years when I have another nonfiction project out in the world, and I might have an entirely different answer for you.
Jesse, what about you when writing, like you said, writing through the amendments? What challenges did you run into with writing about family stories?
Yeah, there was some stuff that's really sensitive that I talk about in my book. And so there are some characters that I changed their name. Mm-hmm. So it provided them with kind of a blanket of anonymity. So nobody would really know that who I'm actually talking about, apart from the person that, you know, if they read it. And then when I was talking about certain really hard issues, I was non-accusatory. So I didn't try to vilify anybody. I just wanted to present the facts as I remembered them, without saying that they were a bad person or I was a bad person or this situation was bad. I just laid it out like you would watch a scene in a movie. That's how I wrote in the literary realism. So that it's like movies playing across your mind's eye. So it's just like, okay, what do you think of this? Then these are the actors that are in the scene that are my family members. And when you do that, there's a kind of a distance from the material that the reader has, as well as the people that when they read it, they can see, oh, look, this is what he perceives from his perspective. And he didn't try to malign my name or make me look bad. He just presented what happened. And that's a way around talking about really difficult situations.
There's nothing like the fact, the image, the cold, hard image itself to carry the truth without having to bring a judgment on it. I think that's a beautiful point, and actually a really great writing tip for anybody out there wanting to write their own story. Begin with the images, begin with those concrete details, and let them speak from the sensory realm, and let them do that work. That's good. Michael, what about you?
Carla, I was just thinking you need to come talk to my creative writing students and tell them that. Yeah, I mean, it's like it's Williams is no idea button things, you know, it's Pound's image is an emotional and intellectual complex in an instant in time. But when it comes to like the ethics of like writing about people you love and care about. I'm reminded of, like, there was that disagreement between Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop. It's well recorded in their letters, when Lowell was using his correspondence with his ex-wife and turning them into poems. And Bishop said, don't do that. Art just isn't worth that much. And so that balance between the truth of your experience and like the feelings of others is hard to maintain. I mean, for me, this book comes out of my love for my family. And so it was important to make decisions around that. In my first book, I went on a 2-week road trip through the interior of British Columbia with my grandfather, and we visited all the former internment camp sites where he was held and his family was held, where other people were kept all through, up past Hope and into the Kootenays. And like a lot of stuff happened on that trip. And my grandfather at the end said, are you going to put everything in the book? And at that minute, I was like, no, I'm not going to put everything in the book. And that's kind of what I've gone by since. I try and make the decisions, that are respectful of my family's privacy as they voice it, because I really care about them. And there are other ways to get to the truth rather than the anecdote in poems anyhow. So.
Well said. Jesse, here's a question directed specifically to you from a viewer. And the question is, first of all, congratulations on a superb book and your successes, says this audience member. I'm curious about how the discovery of your Métis Cree heritage was part of the redemptive process, or was it? Do you want to speak to that? You do reference that in your book about taking a course in Indigenous history and how a particular assignment really set you on a course of finding out about your family history. But was that redemptive?
Yeah, see, I think a lot of people have read my book and think it's a redemption narrative, and it's not. It's not. I'm broken. I have really bad disability. I still suffer with cravings every day. I finish off my book where I'm sleepwalking at the back door because it still happened, or it hasn't happened recently, where I'm so traumatized by the experience of homelessness that in the middle of the night I'll get up and walk out the back door and try to go sleep outside. And my wife will like stop me. Lucy will stop me from doing that. So it wasn't really redemptive. I just showed you what happened in my life. And so part of me coming back to my identity, my cultural identity, was through university. And even that, I don't really know what it is to be Indigenous. I'm playing Indian half the time because I was raised outside of my culture, and I'll never truly know, what that's like. And I tried to show a little bit of that, like the fear of going back to my mom and not knowing if I'd be rejected by her side of the family or what. And so it's just I don't see that my book was redemptive. I just tried to present what happened to me, and part of that was me learning who I am as a Métis Cree person. And I'm by no means there yet. I'm still learning.
Thank you for that. Amanda, one of our viewers asks, and this sort of ties in a little bit to what you just said, Jesse, you don't see it as a redemptive narrative, and yet there does seem to be a preference in the publishing world for stories of triumph, for the redemptive narrative. There seems to be, especially in memoir, anything coming out of a life, we want to see that. Amanda, the question put to you is, if this is a trend, or this is the preference in publishers to seek out this sort of triumph over adversity narrative, what might you have to say about how that very narrative structure, and what's its impact on people with disabilities?
Oh. Okay. It has that, narrative arc, which I think is actually in many ways very much a Western narrative arc. This idea that, there's sort of inciting action and then a climax and then a denouement sort of idea. If you look at stories from other cultures and from other parts of the world, they're often told very differently. But we've become very mired in this idea of the narrative as this packaged thing, right? Where you sort of see a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think for disabled people, that can be really damaging because there's still this assumption that disability is synonymous with an unhappy ending. Like to be disabled is to be, worse than dead for a lot of people. And in order to change that narrative, I think we have to understand that there is no way possible for us to have narratives that tie up neatly in boxes, because our lives don't tie up neatly in boxes. The writer Grace Paley talks about, narrative as being this sort of line between two plot points, right? A to B. And it just sort of leaves out this whole richness of the enormity of human experience. And you essentially want, in writing and in your own life, your characters and yourselves to sort of go out into the world unencumbered by narrative restraint, right? Where you'll have these climaxes and these sort of ups and downs of your life, and they'll continue sort of from between birth and between death, right? Which are the only two true beginnings and endings. And I think we really need to understand that disabled stories in particular do continue to, sure, have tragedy and struggle at the same time as they also continue to have a great deal of richness and happiness and triumph. And the existence of one of these things does not erase the existence of any of the other things. And I think once we understand that, that the whole point of having a rich life and a rich narrative in the stories that we tell is to encompass all of these things, to understand that it is quite possible and indeed preferable, I think, to live your life in such a way that you have joy and sorrow hand in hand. It's like you said, Carla, right, with the two stones in your hand. I think the sort of traditional narrative structure that we have is always reaching toward that idea that the only thing you want to hold in your hand at the end is joy. And I think that does a real disservice to disabled stories, but then also to all stories, to non-disabled stories as well. We need to be able to learn how to hold all of these things in our hands at the same time.
You're right, Amanda, that we are handed this lie that the end of the story must involve us chucking the one quote unquote undesirable stone into the water and just walking away with birdsong behind us and sunlight bathing us with this joy and happiness and the redemption story. But what if the redemptive narrative is the fact that we're just alive? We're still alive. We're still alive here, and able
to walk along, and you continue to move along, holding both stones. That is the redemptive narrative right there.
Here's a question from a viewer, an audience member. I would love to hear how the panel sees the shattered, fragmented world that is a shared trauma the society faces, the sense of truth being lost. This is a big question. How do we get back to love, in your opinion?
It's a beautiful question, though.
It is. I've heard a lot of people speak about the shared trauma that we're in and how we won't know it fully until we're moved out of it. But yeah, it's a big question. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts that start riffing on this idea of how do we get back to love?
Do you have thoughts, Carla? What do you think?
I'm just the moderator. I think part of it does come from what we've talked about, was this humility, this going low and going quiet and starting to listen instead of speak. And starting to, for me, it's loving people is preferring them. It's standing to the side so that the other person can speak, and lifting other people up. And I love that all of you are doing that by lifting up these stories that have been pushed to the margins or kept hidden, or are existing not in this, what we would see as this the loudest voice in our culture. That to me feels like a form of love. It does.
I think there's something too, we were talking a little bit earlier about detail and the power of detail, right? To you can extrapolate so much from tiny little seemingly inconsequential things. And I think that's where that love comes for me. Where it comes most easily is sort of narrowing down and focusing on a very particular detail about a person. And then, you know, from there being like, well, why did so-and-so choose action X, right? What is it about this thing that they're doing? What is it about this detail, you know, this book that they carry around with them that their grandmother gave them, or, you know, and from there, the things that they hold on to. I think, again, it goes back to that not becoming small, but just focusing, right? I am not and never will be a poet. And I'm always so sad about that, because I so admire you poets and your ability to just distill life and language into these very particular moments. And I think the way that I do try to do that is by living poetry and poems and sort of looking at and paying attention to details in the day-to-day and using that as a way to love the world.
That's beautiful. Well, I do feel like we could launch into a whole huge conversation about what love might look like in the world as we continue.
Writers on Zoom, drinking wine, remember?
Exactly. Writers on Zoom. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda, Jesse, and Michael, for bringing your beautiful, glorious selves and your stories, your truth and your beauty to the page, but also to our audience today. It's truly been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you, listen to you, and to be part of this panel and be part of the Victoria Festival of Authors.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for attending this panel. And thank you especially to our moderator and authors, Carla Funk, and Amanda Leduc, Michael Pryor, and Jesse Thistle. And thank you to the organizers of the Victoria Festival Authors and to the festival director, Laura Trunke, for a wonderful afternoon. If you are interested in purchasing any of the books featured today, please support festival sponsor and VFA bookseller Monroe Books. You can find the books featured during the festival at Monroe's and online at monroesbooks.com. There are many more events during the festival, so please visit our website, victoriafestivalofauthors.ca, to view our festival program. Our website also features Q&As with all the authors participating in the VFA 2020 and a place for you to sign up to our newsletter. If you would like to support the festival in another way, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter and encourage your friends to attend one of our upcoming events. You can also make a tax-deductible donation to the Victoria Festival Authors through our website or on VFA's page at Canada Helps. Your donations help to keep VFA an engaging, accessible, and sustainable festival. We hope to see you at our next event, Simply Unbelievable, Fresh Fiction for Unfathomable Times, this afternoon at 4 p.m. Pacific. This event features authors Juicy Gartner, Catherine Hernandez, and Mallory Tater, and Doreen Vanderstoop, and is moderated by Matthew J. Trafford. Bon Festival.